Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. What is an Arab Islamic city, and what does studying the changes to architecture, layout, design tell us about the societies that produced them? Many cities in the Middle East and North Africa have considerable amounts of heritage sites, long histories, places of historical interest. How does this history inform the modern metropolises around them? Joining us to answer some of these questions is Nasser Rabbat. Nasser Rabbat is an Aga Khan professor and director of the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture at MIT. His interests include Islamic architecture, urban history, heritage studies, Arab history, contemporary Islamic art, and post-colonial criticism. He has produced numerous articles and several books on topics ranging from Mamluk architecture in antique Syria, 19th century Cairo, Orientalism, and urban side. His most recent books are Writing Egypt, Al-Markizi and his historical project, Nasser Rabbat's Critical Encounters in 2023, and Imra'at al-Mudun al-Mayata, The Architecture of Dead Cities in 2018. His co-edited book, Reconstruction as Violence, The Case of Syria, will be published in 2024. He is currently editing a book on the cultural history of Syria, tentatively entitled Syria, the Land Where Culture Met, and writing a history of Mamluk Cairo. Professor Rabbat worked as an architect in Los Angeles and Damascus and held several academic appointments at the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in Munich and École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales, ESESS, my French pronunciation is not brilliant here, I'm sorry, Paris, and New York University in Abu Dhabi, UAE. He has received various awards and fellowships and served as a member of the 2019 and the 2020 Aga Khan Award for Architecture Steering Committee. His contributions to several Arabic newspapers serve as the board for various cultural and educational organizations and consultant with the international design firms on projects in the Islamic world. Nasser Rabbat, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, Osman. I'm very glad to be here with you and to discuss a topic that is very dear to my heart.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you, and we're very pleased to see that you have accepted our invite. Now, I sort of want to begin, right at the beginning, so when we sort of think about cities in Egypt and the Levant, up until the 1800s, what are some of the sort of typical features in terms of architecture, layout, design, and what does this tell us about the values, politics, beliefs of the societies that produced them?
Cities, not just in the Levant or in Egypt in general, are usually arenas for some sort of a competition between different groups that constitute the population of the city. Um, in every city, the way cities develop physically, but also in terms of community, in terms of civility, is basically what kind of a framework all of these various groups that are competing for dominance, for more space inside the city, what frame of reference do they refer to in their struggle? And what makes those cities the way they are is that the frame of reference is Islamic law. And when I say Islamic law, it's not because I want to say Sharia as something that is distinct from the idea of law. It's basically the law of the land. It's a whole body of legal opinions that have developed from the time of the Prophet and the Prophet reorganization of his own city, which changed its name from Yathrib to the city of the Prophet. It's called Madinat al-Rasul. We actually call it Medina today, but the full name of the city is Madinat al-Rasul, the city of the Prophet, because the Prophet is its dayan, is its judge, is the person who is setting the rules for it. I want you to imagine that this has developed over the 700 or 800 years that separate the life of the Prophet from the cities that we are talking about in the medieval period, and that has produced a huge body of legal opinions and rules that governed the way communities negotiate between themselves their space in the city. So what distinguishes these cities is Islamic law, first and foremost. Now, how does Islamic law translate into the physical space? Of course, the first and most important thing is that Muslims need places to pray. So what distinguishes these cities are mosques. Muslims, and especially from the 10th, 11th century, need spaces to learn. And this is where the institution of the madrasa comes in. And in the period that we are in, they become really, madrasas in general, they become a major component of the urban fabric of these cities. Muslims need spaces to wash because ablution is required before you pray. And that's where you see a network of hammam in these cities, something that European cities didn't have until the 20th century. The idea of actually having hygiene as a public concern. And Muslims need spaces also for exchange, marketplaces. And of course, you have the rulers and the space of the rulers. In the period that we are speaking about, there is a new phenomenon that appears in Islamic cities, which is that the rulers, instead of living in palaces, started building citadels. And this phenomenon of urban citadel is something that distinguishes all the cities from Central Asia all the way to North Africa that have been or have become capitals of Islamic powers in the period of the disintegration of the caliphate and the rise of separate entities, political entities. So take all the cities that you are thinking about in the period we are covering now, let's say between the 11th and the 16th century, and you'll find that each and every one of them, when it had a dynasty rule in it, the dynasty lived in an urban citadel. What is an urban citadel? It's basically an enclosure for the ruler and his army that is part of the urban fabric, but separated from it by walls. So I want you to imagine a circle that is the city. Most of these cities are walled, and an intersecting small circle with it that is the citadel. So it is both part of the urban fabric and separate from it. That is a distinguishing feature. All of these cities have more than one in most cases, but in some cases still one congregational mosque, the mosque where all the people would come to. And then all of these cities have networks of madrasas and networks of hammam. That's what distinguishes these cities.
It's interesting because as you were talking, you mentioned the fact that fundamentally it's the presence of Islamic law in these cities that make it, in a sense, an Islamic city. But if we think about Islamic law, especially in the medieval period, we're not simply talking about Sharia, as you alluded to in your answer. We're talking about various local customs, which are part of the local law. And so it seems to me what you're saying here is when we think about Islamic city, we have to think about a specific Islamic city and think about what those local beliefs are for shaping what that city will be. Is that a broadly accurate way of thinking about it?
I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that because there is a suprastratum of Islamic law that applies to all of these cities. And then you have the local customs and the local traditions. So I'm actually interested in that suprastructure, the structure that allows jurists to interfere in the functioning of the urban space by referring to some sort of an Islamic regulation that needs to be observed. I mean, I'll speak for uh, one phenomenon, if you want. In most of these cities, there is a position that is called the muhtasib. Usually in English, they translate it as the market supervisor. But the muhtasib is way more than the market supervisor. The muhtasib is that official of the state whose position is to go around the city in general, not just in the market, and observe that Islamic law is observed, is applied. And by Islamic law is applied, it's not how you build, but how you treat other in the street, how you sell, how you buy, how you occupy the public space, how you occupy the public space sonorously in terms of sound. The muhtasib had the authority of telling you, lower the volume. You are interfering with the life of others. So this idea of regulating the space in a larger scheme of things is very Islamic, because this muhtasib, his authority comes from the judges, and the judges are the judges that basically rule according to one of the four dominant Sunni legal schools or the Shiite legal school, depending on the dominant population, dominant direction of the population. So to me, this is what makes the Islamic city function as an Islamic city. Now you come down and you could actually start observing that there are, again, I mean, cities where the Sunni are the majority, cities where the Shiite are the majority, that has an impact on the public space and on the urban space in general. You have cities in which the majority is not Muslim. How do you deal with that? Like, let's take, for example, the cities of India in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. So it's all then functions, as you're saying, as a combination between what I'm calling superstratum or suprastratum of Islamic law, and then the rules and regulations that have developed internally. But if you are looking for something that unifies all of these cities together, I would still say it is Islamic law. And Islamic law, just to be clear, has no section on urban spaces. So Islamic law has not busied itself in judging what you build and how you build it. It busies itself only in if you infringe on the right of others by building your building, whatever that building is, whether it's a mosque or a house or a market or a palace. Islamic law has a view about not infringing on the right of the others, and therefore it comes and sort of like asks you to modify what you're doing. But it does not have rules and regulations in the sense of zoning, for example. There's no zoning section in Islamic law that says streets have to be this wide, streets have to be straight, buildings cannot go above a certain level, and so on. That is not something that Islamic law has busied itself in.
So I have a question here, because this is something you do see being brought up a lot. I mean, there is a sort of feature we do see across many cities from the medieval period, Muslim cities in the medieval period, which is the sheer size of buildings, right? So if we were to compare to, say, Europe, what we see in Europe, we see big mega cathedrals, large palaces being built, very large structures. But we don't, when we look in Muslim cities in the Middle East, and especially from the medieval period, we do find obviously a few big mosques, but comparatively speaking, nowhere near on the size of what's being built in Europe. Why do we see this? What is this all about?
I'm tempted to say, and this is very speculative on my side, is because of a certain democracy in the ruling class, not in the general society. What we see in the Islamic world after the arrival of the Seljuks in the 11th century is the rise of the ruling class that is military in orientation, of which you have multiple sultans that appear in different places, but all of these sultans are dependent on emirs that are um, um, enjoying almost equal amount of power. It's almost like primus inter alis that you see these sultans. So there is no concentration of authority in the city to the point where all the resources go in the direction of one building. And the second point, and it's a very important point, there is no church in Islamic cities. That is, there is no religious authority that is financially independent. The ulama which constitute the religious class in the Islamic city, are totally dependent on the rulers. Whereas in medieval Europe, the building of big cathedrals was the combination of money coming from the church. Most of the big cathedrals were built by the cardinals of the city or by the patriarch if it's not a Catholic city, or the king. And the king had much more power than the sultan in terms of the finance in most cases, not in all cases. So in the Islamic city, you see patronage distributed among a large class of people, which are the umara or the emirs, the people that hold power, but they are not the ultimate power. They're not sultan. And by the way, I'm sure you know that the supreme title in the medieval Islamic period for the supreme ruler is sultan. And sultan means pure and simple power. So the main title for the ruler in the Islamic world is not, in the medieval period, is not caliph, is not king, it's actually power, which tells you that what we are talking about is some sort of a system of control, of power that is shared by a whole class in Egypt and Syria between the 12th and the 16th century. We call them the Mamluks, but elsewhere they are also the same kind of class of emirs, and among them they select or they accept the dominance of one who acquires the title of sultan. Patronage translates into dispersed building in the city, but never on a large scale.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So let's just zoom into a particular city then to sort of get more, concrete examples. So when we think about the Mamluks in Cairo, right? Obviously, Cairo was, developed into a city before the Mamluks came along. You had the Fatimids, you had different dynasties, you had Ayyubids as well. But when that becomes a Mamluk city, Cairo distinctly changes in terms of how it looks, in terms of obviously its importance, everything sort of changes. So could we sort of talk to us a little bit about how the Mamluks changed Cairo and what they did for the city?
Mhm. I would say there are a few important points to understand about how the Mamluks treated Cairo. First, Cairo is the capital of the empire. The concentration of all power was in Cairo. The Mamluks were very reluctant, as a matter of fact. Mamluk emirs, when they were appointed to be like governors of Jerusalem, Aleppo, or Damascus, some of them would come to the Sultan and say, please keep me here. I don't want to go there, because they knew that power is in Cairo. But the most important aspect of it is the Mamluks were slaves born outside of the Islamic world, brought as slaves to the Islamic world, trained militarily and taught to read and write and taught the Quran. So these individuals knew that they don't have the legitimacy of having been born in a ruling class. They needed to prove themselves. They proved themselves in two directions. One is fighting for Islam. They are the best fighters for Islam. They stopped the Mongol wave and they finished off the Crusaders in Palestine and Syria, and they made foray into Christian principalities and kingdoms in what is today Turkey, in Anatolia and Armenia. And they controlled the two sacred cities of Mecca and Medina, and they made also campaigns down in Nubia and Sudan and to Libya and so on. So they basically distinguished themselves as fighters for Islam in order to legitimize their rule, to say, you need us, we are the fighters. But internally, they needed to do something else. They needed to patronize Islamic institution. Therefore, they started building a lot of institutions. And given the concentration of power in Cairo, a lot of those institutions were built in Cairo. The late Michael Meineke counted around 2,500 or 2,600 buildings that were patronized by Mamluk emirs during the Mamluk period, basically to the total of 10 buildings a year. About 6 of them were in Cairo, and the other 4 were all over the empire. So the Mamluks built more monuments, small in size, as you noticed, than any dynasty in history, I would say. No one has built as much because of the multiplicity of patronage, because all the emirs were building and competing with each other. So Cairo has a lot of very elegant but small monuments, small mosques, small madrasas, small khanqahs, Sabil Kutab, which is actually a type of building that was invented in Cairo and doesn't exist anywhere else. It's a charitable institution that has a public fountain in the first floor and a room to teach the young boys and girls sometimes to memorize the Quran, the Kutab, where you learn how to read and write. I want you to imagine this. There are about 600 of them that were built in Cairo, and they are dispersed all over the place. They provide water and they create this sonorous environment in which you hear the Quran recited the whole day in the city. So the Mamluks, because of that fragmentation of power and because of the concentration of all the wealth in Cairo, produced that many monuments. But there is a dark side to the story. And if you give me 2 minutes, I'll explain it.
Take all the time you want.
So the Mamluks were dependent, like all the military dynasties in the Islamic world from the late Abbasid period on a system that is called the Iqta, which is land assignment. So instead of being paid a salary by the state, if you are an emir, the state would assign you the income of a district. You might not live in a district. The district is far away. You send your tax collectors there. The Mamluks lived off the income of that district as long as they are governing, as long as they are part of the ruling class. The moment they die, or they are dismissed of their position, or they are imprisoned because the Sultan is angry at them, they lose their iqta, they lose the revenue of that land. They cannot pass that to their progeny. In Europe, the equivalent system is the feudal system. You control a piece of land, you pass that piece of land to your progeny. In the Mamluk, no, you do not. It reverts back to the state. The only way for you to provide income for your descendants is to be able to claim part of that land. And how do you do it? You build a charitable institution and you designate part of that land as waqf, as endowment for it. And the waqf system in Islamic law, that's why Islamic law is very important, by the way, is perpetual. So if you say, I'm going to endow village X to my mosque in Cairo, the state has no power to take village X from that endowment. But of course, actually, that endowment is charitable. The idea is that you are going to get the income to support the functioning of that mosque. How are you going to pass part of that money to your progeny? You appoint yourself as the supervisor of the waqf and you give yourself a salary. And you say in the waqf document, in the endowment document, that after me, it's my sons that become the controllers. And after them, it's their sons. And after them is their sons in perpetuity. And if there is no progeny for me, it goes to my Mamluks, my slaves. And if I have no Mamluks left, then it goes back to the state. This is how the Mamluks managed to appropriate part of the wealth that they couldn't keep for themselves, which means that they have an incentive to build charitable institutions. And that's why they built a lot of them.
That's always an interesting thing to think about, is the economic side of how you incentivize this sort of thing. But I'm sort of also now wondering, when we're talking about these institutions that were built in Cairo, there's obviously not just an economic and a political, there's also a kind of metaphysical reality to them, that there's with the way the sort of things you're sort of building reflects your sort of religious view about, you know, what the function of that thing is, but also the ideas of trying to convey. So how did sort of religious beliefs that the Mamluks held shape the way that they thought about building things?
Well, remember, the Mamluks are boys that are born somewhere in Central Asia or in the Caucasus to non-Muslim families. And they are brought young and taught Islam. And they are taught a staunch version of Sunni Islam, usually. So most of the Mamluks were basically very religious, observant persons. And a lot of them joined Sufi orders and became members of the Sufi. And we have few, not many, Mamluks who actually have become religious scholars themselves. And because their sons cannot inherit the position or the wealth of their fathers, they usually instructed their sons to go into scholarship. And we have a lot of the sons of the Mamluks that have become ulama themselves. So you have an ulama class that is very prominent in the city. And how does that reflect on what is happening in the city is that the ulama class became, or the ulama became the consultants of the Mamluks. And of course, the ulama were pushing for more religious institution in the city to serve their own purposes, but also because of their belief. But the most important thing about it also is that the Mamluks, and I want to emphasize this point, were true Muslims, were actually very staunch Muslims. And therefore, they actually wanted to create a city in which Islam is very visible. That's why Cairo is known as a city of 1,000 minarets. Cairo does not need, I mean, there are much less than 1,000 minarets, but let's say about 250 is what we're talking about. Cairo does not need 250 minarets for sure, but everyone was building a building and marking their building by building a minaret next to it. They even scrapped the rule that used to say that you need to have a certain number of people around a congregational mosque to have a minaret on it. Otherwise, you will have only small neighborhood mosques. You have in Cairo mosques that are holding the Friday prayer that are only 100 meters away from each other, which basically does not provide for the population. Perhaps this is another reason why the mosques are small. But Cairo is a city in which the call to the prayer, which is an attestation of the faith for Islam, is repeated 5 times a day on more than 250 minaret in a medieval city of about 60 to 70,000 inhabitants. So I want you to imagine the kind of space and sound that this creates. Add to that all these kutabs that I'm telling you about that were being built. They're cheaper than to build a mosque or a madrasa. To build a public fountain, and you have now water provided for everyone in Cairo for free by the same patrons, by the ulama and the emirs. And on top of that, and that's what I said is a Cairo invention, is the kutab, is the classroom where these kids sit all day long and they are taught to memorize the Quran. So I want you to imagine yourself as a medieval person walking down the streets in Cairo, and all you hear all the time are young angelic voices reciting the Quran as you move from one place to the other. And these are distanced from each other by just 100 meters maximum. So you will never be out of a sound space or a soundscape in which the Quran is recited. And then 5 times a day, there is the call to prayer from the 250 minarets. So I want to again to imagine how strong that is. And in Cairo, they even invented something that is called the Sultanian Adhan, the Sultanian call to prayer, which basically is very similar to the a cappella singing of today. You will have on the 3, remember the minarets in the Mamluk tradition have 3 galleries or 3 balconies. On the 3 balconies, you will have up to 12 muezzin, and they syncopate the recitation of the adhan. So the soundscape of Cairo was very much imbued with the presence of Islam. And of course, the streets were imbued with the presence of Islam because of all the madrasas, the khankas, the zawiya, the shrines, and the mosques, and the Friday mosques. And on top of that, all these small units of Sabil Kutab, of these classrooms that are all around. Cairo, space-wise and sound-wise, was the most Islamic city in history.
It's interesting as we're talking about this because, of course, we also have a command from the Quran to where you're commanded to permit the good and forbid the evil. to put it bluntly. And so it sort of reflects a little bit in how cities are supposed to be managed, because of course, as we're talking about Cairo and the way it's been, developed under Mamluk rule,
Mhm.
at the same time that all of this is happening, you do have another side to Cairo that exists at this time, right? You have a city of virtue, but you have a city of vice as well. I mean, you've got spaces where criminality does happen. You have, places where there's prostitution. You have all sorts of things. So, talk to us a little bit about the other side of Cairo during this period and how the Mamluks sort of sought to deal with it.
So I avoided referring to the promotion of good and the resistance against evil, because a whole school of contemporary thinkers have used these two principles. One that says la darara wa la dirar, that is, you don't cause harm and you don't accept harm to be caused to you. And the second is al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi al munkar, is to push for the good or to promote good and to forbid evil. A whole school of thinkers in the last 30 or 40 years have used these two principles to explain the urban policy in Islam. To me, it's insufficient because these are reactive rules. They are not proactive. I am saying that there is a proactive action of actually imbuing the city with Islamic institution before the harm is done, because you are trying to create that city. So I will not put too much emphasis on it, but I will agree that it is the basis of a lot of the interference, for example, of the muhtasib that I was telling you about, the so-called market supervisor, which I actually would rather call him the person that makes sure that the law is observed in all aspects of life. He is the one that used to go to secret places for the production of alcohol and break in all the jars of alcohol. He is the one that used to go, when he hears about a house that is used for prostitution, that will go and close the door. And guess what they did usually? They will take all these poor prostitutes, who in most cases they would be forced to become prostitutes, and marry them off on the account of the city. The city pays for their marriage. So yes, there is a side, a criminality side, and there is now a bunch of very, very, very creative scholars that are investigating that. And some books have come out on that side of the city, if you want. But I would say that the authority that is the religious authority of the city, the ulama, have actually tried very hard to fight that. Remember, we have a ruling class of the Mamluks that is made out of thousands of these people who have power and who are belligerent and who are, in many instances, violent. And of course, actually, sometimes they think of themselves as above the law and they have the power to do that. A lot of the vices that were happening in Cairo in the Mamluk period were caused by the Mamluks themselves, by their infighting, but also by their economic and political power that allows them to transcend the law and to transgress the law and to be able to do whatever they want to do. So they probably were the clientele of the prostitution houses, the clientele of the bars, or I mean, not bars, I should say, but sort of like what would be the word for it? I mean, the place.
Evans,
Taverns, yes, exactly. So again, I would say that the vice in Cairo is the other side of the coin to the good in Cairo, because it's the same class that is producing both. It's the Mamluk class that is patronizing religious institution, and it's the Mamluk class that is creating the clientele for spaces of vice. And of course, there is the underworld and there are the criminals, like all crowded, busy medieval cities. So there's nothing really unusual about it. But I would say that the the law, as it was understood at the period, was actually keeping up with that. So yes, there is vice, but it's not unusual. I mean, Cairo is not sort of like known as the place, as the Las Vegas of its time, for example. It's not the place where you go in order to have your desires satisfied. But yes, if you are an inhabitant there, there are places where you could go and get those desires satisfied. But I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it. It's a normal city of that size of its own time.
And just a quick question, because obviously in Egypt, you will often hear the expression, Cairo is the mother of the world or the center of the world. When does that sort of reputation develop for Cairo?
Probably in the Mamluk period. I wouldn't say that it was before, but you have to remember that the Egyptians are very, very, very cosmocentric. Egypt, because of its nature, is an extremely centered country. Egypt is a vast expanse of desert that has the Nile crossing it in the middle. And until now, more than 90% of Egyptians live on the banks of the Nile. So the rest of the country is basically empty. So you have the Delta and the Nile. So that idea of Egypt is the center of the world is very strong in the mind of the Egyptians because they really are all concentrated on this one line of the Nile. And remember also that in the south, and on the border between today's Egypt and Sudan, there are multiple cataracts that make the navigation very difficult to go down between Egypt and Sudan. You can't actually navigate big boats, but you can get a boat to come from Alexandria all the way down to Aswan, which means that the country is connected. This is the highway of the country and has been the highway for thousands of years. So to think of the capital city as the center of the world is a natural outgrowth of thinking of Egypt as the center of the world and thinking of Egypt. The Egyptians are probably the first people in history, maybe the Chinese are the equivalent, that had a sense of nationalism before nationalism as an idea developed. They thought of themselves as part of Egypt much more so than what we call the Syrians today thought of themselves, or the Iraqis, or the Iranians, or the Tajiks, or whatever. I mean, the idea of being Egyptian is a very old idea, and it's so entrenched to the point where until today, the Egyptians are probably the most nationalistic in the region. And as a matter of fact, up until very recently, Egyptians did not migrate. I mean, if you look at generations of immigrants in, let's say, up until about 1950, in Western countries, you will find a lot of Shuam, Syrians, Palestinian, Lebanese, but you also find a lot of South Asians, but you don't find a lot of Egyptians. Now the situation has changed, and that's because of the economic dire strait of Egypt. But up until a generation ago, or maybe 2 generations ago, there was very little Egyptian migration because of that sense of belonging that is so strong. So Masr Dunya, and I want you to remember that they use the word Masr Dunya. Masr is Egypt, but they apply it to Cairo. So in the mind of the Egyptians, Cairo and Egypt are interchangeable.
Yeah, it's one of the more unique features of Egypt is that it is very concentrated in that way, but also the way they think about Cairo. And it seems like that's obviously quite an old idea. But we do need to sort of move on because I wanted to ask you a little bit about hygiene and, things related to health and hygiene in the city. When we think about, since we're talking about Cairo, we can think about it in the context of Mamluk Cairo. How do they think about things like hygiene, healthcare, and to be in good health, and things conducive to that, environments conducive to that?
Well, in the pre-modern city in general, the idea of health was something that had either a religious charitable edge to it, so you establish hospices or hospitals as part of your charitable work, or they were neglected. And the observation of people that came to Cairo in the late 19th century, European, is that Cairo was an extremely unhygienic city. But if we go back to the Mamluk period, there were measures that were being taken to provide for the health and the hygiene of the city. The health is in the establishment of bimaristan or hospitals. And we know of at least three major bimaristans that were established in the Mamluk period, the most important of which is the bimaristan of Sultan Qalawun, which is called the bimaristan al-Mansuri. It's in the center of the old Fatimid city. And that bimaristan, I would say, is probably the most advanced medieval hospital anywhere in the world. We have its waqf, and we can read what kinds of measures were being taken. But of course, it wasn't enough. So yes, there were hospitals, but I mean, healthcare was very much sort of like a personal concern. In terms of the hygiene, I would say that the requirement of ablution of wudu for Muslims before they pray, and the requirement of washing your body after having intercourse or after going to the toilet, that means that you needed water in the city at all time. And Cairo had hundreds of hammams that are spread all over, and people use them regularly. And in the case of Cairo, I want you to imagine how difficult it is to provide for water. Because even though we think of Cairo today as a city on the banks of the Nile, medieval Cairo was 3 miles away from the Nile. And there were two aqueducts that brought water, but they did not serve the city. They served the citadel. They served the ruling class. The city depended on water carriers that brought the water from the River Nile to the city, either on the back of beasts of burden or on their own back. So even though Cairo had more than 200 hammams that were studied and classified by the late André Rameau, the water for these hammams was carried on the back of animals and of people to be brought from the Nile to the city, those 3 miles distance. And yet, Cairo had 200 functioning hammams at the time in which the European cities, which will become models of hygiene, had no hammams whatsoever. So people in there, I don't know how they bathe, but in Cairo, we know that you could bathe every day if you want, because there's a hammam at the end of the street. And a lot of people did go on a regular basis, usually once a week, to the hammam. So that's the level of hygiene that I can speak of.
Yes, it's and this seems to be a feature across. I mean, when we talk about common features, we find hammams are across many Arab and Islamic cities. We have quite a few in Damascus. We have quite a few in Aleppo, in Jerusalem. So it's this one of the perhaps features we find across the board,
Oh,
um,
absolutely.
because of course, you know, most of the other cities, obviously cities have their own unique things, but there are certain features we find across, and hammam is one of them. I now want to sort of bring us onto the modern city because there's often, within the scholarship that deals with history on the Arab world, just generally, you find that there's generally a sort of idea that there's a cutoff point between the sort of older pre-modern world and its transition into the modern world, which is usually around 1800s or thereabouts, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after, but around about 1800, which is the appearance, obviously, of things like European empires as they start to colonize, the end of the Ottoman world, and so on. And so we tend to think of this time period as a discontinuity rather than a continuity with the past, where many traditions were uprooted and so on. So when it comes to thinking about cities and how they've changed in, let's say, Egypt, Syria, or wherever, what, on this level, how is this? How does this debate sort of play out? I mean, do we see a massive discontinuity with the past, let's say?
The answer is yes, but it has to be contextualized. So what has happened is that around the second half of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire received major blows in the form of defeats in its war, mostly with the Tsarist Russian Empire, but also with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and occasionally with the Italian republics in battles in the sea. So by I would say around 1770, the Ottoman Empire was retreating, was defeated, And the intellectuals of the Ottoman Empire started looking for an answer to the question, why are we losing? Why are we being defeated? And they ultimately landed on three possibilities. One of their, and before I get to the three possibilities, one of their inspiration was the writing of Ibn Khaldun from the 14th century, who was observing mostly from Cairo the rise and fall of empire and explaining the rise and fall of empire. So they used him in order to try to understand, why are we falling as an empire? We are a very strong empire. We have amazing resources. Why are we being defeated? So they came with three answers that still exist today in the thinking of all Muslims anywhere in the world. One is, we have failed to develop a modernity. We need to import the European modernity wholesale. We need to apply the European modernity to our life wholesale. The second was, no, we cling to our Islam and we reject modernity and we push back against it. And the third is, we import modernity, but we modify it because of our own particular culture, our own particular religion. There had been experiments at all three levels, but I would say the experiment that said we import modernity and modify it a little bit is the dominant solution that you find across the Islamic world even today. The way the Islamic world deals with the present today is, we import, but we modify because of our own particular traditions and customs. In my humble opinion, this is the wrong solution, but we're not going to get into that. We will just take it at face value that this is what was happening. The city is not the top concern. The top concern for that modernization was the army. It's, how can I modernize the army? So the city is a much late comer into the debate of what would happen to the city. So when the modernization of the city became a necessity, and I would say not 1800, this is not going to happen until about the 1850, 1860 in the major cities. And in the two cities where it started, they are Istanbul and Cairo. And then it starts spreading into the other cities. Tehran is a much latecomer, for example. Bukhara is a latecomer. Delhi is a latecomer in that. Delhi, of course, actually, its own modernization is going to be cut short by the revolt of 1857 and the imposition of British rule in there. But Cairo, Istanbul, Tehran, Bukhara, and few other cities, and then Damascus, Aleppo, and so on, are going to go through this new development, which at the beginning was, let's try to introduce new hygienic measures. Let's try to introduce wider street into this very dense medieval fabric of the city. By 1860s, they realized that this is not an easy solution. So they started building parallel modern cities to the old medieval city. And we start having the phenomenon of the dual city, of what in North Africa is called Limdina, the old city, or the Qasaba, the old city, and next to it is the modern city, which in North Africa is called exactly as such, La Ville Nouvelle, the new city. So if you look at the plans of all the cities from Marrakesh all the way to Tehran and Delhi, actually further, probably Dhaka, I would say, but I don't know the map of Dhaka, you would see the core of the traditional city almost suffocating with modern development on its periphery. And in few of these cases, the development went all to the modern city, and the old city was left to wither away, to basically fall apart, until the second half of the 20th century, where a lot of the people started realizing that their traditional cities have a lot of heritage, and you have the movement of restoration. But it's really a realization of the defeat that led to the desire to modernize and moved on. With the coming of the colonial powers, that was consecrated as a new form of development. New city versus the old city. But the first model of that is actually the city of Cairo and it was the local authority that imposed the new city against the old city. So it's not a colonial invention. The colonials just took it a step further.
It's interesting because, I mean, one of the things you do sort of see when you go to many cities in the Middle East, for example, I mean, Damascus is really famous for this, where you have an old city which is completely walled in, and then you have a completely modern city around it. And one of the things you sort of notice is that, depending on what city you're in general, and this is obviously a big generalization based on my travels across the cities of Syria, the old city has very little to do with the modern city, with the exception of perhaps parts of Damascus and Aleppo. All the others feel like they're just for tourists. There's not actually much that happens there. Most people are in the modern part of the city, and so there's a discontinuity between the two. Obviously architecturally they're very differently, but just everyday life and function is just very discontinuous.
Mhm.
So I sort of want to invite you to comment on that. Is how does the heritage today sort of interact with the modern city?
So, I mean, the thing is, the moment you have the majority of the educated and well-to-do classes accept the idea that they need to modernize, that they need to follow the European model, a lot of them are going to move out of the traditional city because it does not adapt very easily to the European model. So this is how you have all these neighborhoods developing. So what happens to the old city at that moment? And that is something that one could trace to the late 19th century all the way to about the middle of the 20th century, is that those properties that used to be in the hand of well-to-do individuals, individuals that could maintain them, individuals that took care of them, are going to become rental units. And because the people that are modernizing are not going to live in them, so they become rental unit to migrants from the rural areas who have no urban sense. So that the old traditional city is falling apart because no one is paying for its maintenance, and the owners of these big houses, say for example, are no longer interested in their maintenance. They're renting them, and they are subdividing them and renting them to whoever wants to rent them. This is what happened to cities like Aleppo, Damascus, Cairo, but I would actually say also to other cities. Istanbul, the peninsula of Istanbul was actually falling apart when you start developing the sides of the Bosphorus, when you start developing the European side, Pera of Istanbul. So it took the beginning of a realization of the touristic, basically economic value of heritage for the authority to come back to the old city and say, let's restore. And of course, actually, it's almost always an incomplete job because restoration of monuments is not sufficient. Monuments are part of a large urban fabric, and now the urban fabric is in a very, very bad state. So you go back and restore a madrasa or a mosque, but the neighborhood around it is falling apart and no one is maintaining it. And therefore, your mosque is going to stand alone as sort of like a monument in the middle of a dirty environment that is not going to attract the tourists. I mean, I'll tell you from Cairo, for example, people who go for tourism in Cairo, probably less than 10% of them visit the medieval city. They go to the citadel, they go to the pyramid, they go to the Egyptian museum, they go to Luxor and Aswan, they go and swim in the Red Sea. No one goes to visit the Mamluk gems in the old city because the neighborhoods are awful and you cannot just go there and walk around and so on. You need to be accompanied. You can be harassed. The streets are dirty. Sometimes the streets are flooded with sewage water. So it's actually not a nice environment, even though the buildings are superior to anything that you can visit. Old Cairo competes with Florence and Rome in the density of monuments. Florence and Rome make billions of people going and visiting these. Old Cairo does not generate as much. Now there are efforts to actually restore streets in the old city of Cairo, but the job is really, really, really large because of a century of neglect.
This feels like an opportune moment to actually talk about this, which is the because it's not just the old cities. I mean, obviously the old cities are very dirty, and it's not just Cairo either. I mean, a lot of cities in the like I've been to like Beirut, Damascus, all these different cities. they do have a lot of issues with how dirty they can be, even in the modern cities, right? So you go everywhere and there's rubbish everywhere, there's landfills everywhere, just randomly. How did it get like this? Why is it like this?
I would say the deeper cause is of the incomplete or the erratic application of modern measures. So I will take it back to that earlier debate that I was talking about when people were saying we will import modernity, but we will modify it. The modification, if you want, cut the power from modernity to uh, control and regulate the space. So the problem of these cities is that their zoning laws are erratic, and the authority of the city, and that is a political problem, is very weak. In European cities, in modern European cities, the city controls its rules and regulations. It's the city that issues the zoning law, and it's the city that has the power of making the inhabitants comply with them. In our modern Islamic world, where dictatorships dominate, the dictatorship does not allow the city to have any measure of political power. So the city depends for its well-being on the central authority. And the central authority does not have the city as a top priority. Again, it's the army, the foreign relationship, maybe the economy, whatever it is. So the space of the city is not well taken care of in terms of rules and regulations, because there are so many people that tell you the people in the Middle East are dirty and therefore they would dirty their cities. That's nonsense. All people could be dirty or clean. The only reason why you become clean is that you are taught to be clean. And if you decide to be dirty, if you throw garbage in the street in Paris, you'll be fined 1,000 euros and you'll have to pay them. If you throw garbage in the street in Cairo, most probably there's no authority that is going to come after you and say you're going to have to pay a fine. And if there is such an authority, you bribe the guy with 100 euros and you escape the paying of the 1,000 euros or guinea instead of euros. So the main reason for the dysfunctioning cities in the Islamic world today, the main two reasons are political. One is the centralization of dictatorial power to the point where the city does not have a legal authority or political authority to manage itself. And the second is, again, the competing views of modernity and traditionalism that have created this sort of like unhappy hybrid creature, which is how we live today. There are two frames of reference. One is the traditions and the customs and Islamic law, and the other is the modern legal codes that have been imported from Europe. They don't live well together. So, in my opinion, what you are seeing in the city, when you go to the city and say they can be dirty, is a phenomenon that has to do with the dysfunctional political structures in these countries and the dysfunctional legal structures in these countries.
Yeah, it's always interesting because, of course, corruption is a part of this. I mean, I remember once on a completely unrelated topic, I was listening to this Egyptian woman talk about when she was stopped by traffic police, and the police officer said, "You have to pay a fine, but you don't have to pay the fine if you just give me some money now, as in you bribe me." And she said, "I refuse to give the bribe, so just give me the fine." And everyone was sort of amazed because she was talking in front of other people, amazed at this. And then there's this one Lebanese one puts up her hand and asks, "So was the fine less than the bribe?" That's the sort of cultural mentality you get. But it's interesting because also I remember you said to me before we had this chat that from your perspective, the best preserved Islamic Arab city is not in the Arab world, it's in Sicily, right? So what is it about Sicily that's so well preserved?
The power of the city. Yeah, I mean, let me put it this way to go back to the idea of bribery. Bribery is the result, again, of conflicting and unclear legal structures and consequently, of course, economic disparity. But if you live in a place in which you know that when you are being fined because you broke the law, not because some whimsical holder of authority decided that you broke the law and you are going to bribe them, then you will have less resistance to actually paying the fine. So what's happening in Sicily, and Sicily is actually the worst example. Remember that Sicily was until very recently ruled by the mafia. But what we have in Sicily is the functioning of a modern state in which cities have authority over their space. Our cities don't. They don't have authorities over their space. It's the central authority of the government, of the dictator, that has the authority over the city. And they don't care too much about the city. It's not their first concern. They have other concerns, but when you endow the city through elections, through city council, with the power to rule its own space, you will find much better working cities. And also, you will find the citizens invested in their cities because they are now part of a political system in which they can aspire as citizens to become council members through elections and to go around and say, we need more schools, we need cleaner streets, we need this, we need that, at the level of the city. And let me add one thing also. Cities in the West, the city where I live in, Watertown, collects taxes from the inhabitants of the city. So the city is not dependent on the central authority. It has its own source of income. In the Islamic world, the city gets its money from the central authority. It does not collect tax separately. All the taxes go to the central authority, and then the central authority redisperses them. So what we are looking at is the lack of a political structure, the lack of a civic political structure that allows city to control their own spaces.
And so my last question then is, what does the rise of the Gulf tell us about the future of Arab cities? Because of course, when we're thinking about when we look at every opinion poll, where do young Arabs want to live most likely? It's usually, top cities are places like Dubai and places like this. And the Gulf generally seems to have risen quite a lot. And so when we think about the future of the Arab city, how does the Gulf influence this?
Negatively. But let's actually dissect this question. The Gulf cities are extremely wealthy cities. Therefore, they are cities that are attractive to live in. And the authorities of the Gulf cities have decided that they want to embellish their cities. So they are creating beautiful cities. They are pouring a lot of money into the creation of these beautiful cities. And they are creating economic opportunities for people to work there. And because what we are looking at in the Gulf are almost city states, every city has its own ruler. Therefore, we are getting close to the model that I'm speaking about of cities controlling their own fate, because the ruler is actually the ruler of this one city. So he has authority over the space of that city, and therefore civic laws are observed and imposed and applied. Whereas in the old cities of the Arab world, in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Beirut, in Cairo, you have a disintegration of the central authority, no political authority in the city to control the city, and therefore the future is really bleak. And the effect of the cities in the Gulf is that they are sapping some of the energy of these cities, because any successful Cairene or Damascene or Beiruti would aspire to go and work in Dubai. And therefore, these cities are losing the talents that are going elsewhere. It's not necessarily by plan, but create an attractive environment and a less attractive environment. Everyone's going to try to go to the attractive environment. So I would say the effect of the Gulf cities on the older Arab cities is negative, even if some of these cities or some of the rulers of these cities are investing back in the old city, but that's not enough. The old cities are really disintegrating and they are losing all of their brains that are migrating elsewhere, either to the west or to the new attractive centers in the Gulf. And they have central authorities that are very dictatorial. They have no tradition of civility and civics in the cities because no one has developed such a tradition in the last 2 centuries. So you have citizens in the city who do not feel that they belong to their cities or that they have any power over the fate of their city because there's no legal structure that allows them to do that. So if reform is going to come to these cities, in my opinion, it's not in the form of pouring money, it's in the form of actually giving these cities some legal independence to control their own space, to allow the citizens of the city to run their cities.
Yeah, it's also important to also think about here that traditionally, when we think about the Muslim world or important centers of the Muslim world in medieval times, we tend to think about cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, Isfahan, these cities. We did not tend to think of Gulf cities as much, with the exception of Mecca and Medina for specifically religious purposes. But now we're sort of seeing a complete reversal of the role where now it's all the Gulf cities that are being held up as the future of the region and where everything is happening and where everything needs to orientate towards. But of course, the cultural traditions of these societies are so vastly different to places like Iraq and Syria and so on.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, what's happening is that these cities are becoming magnets for talents. And you have to remember that what unifies the cities in the Gulf with the old cities of Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and I would say even Rabat and Marrakesh and Algiers and Beirut and Baghdad and all of these cities is the language, is the Arabic language. And when these cities are becoming centers of culture, they are attracting all the talents from these old cities to come to them. And that's adding to the luster of these cities. These cities, the Gulf cities, are basically importing talents from everywhere in the world. And they are creating bases for that talent to stay. They're basically telling talented individuals, how much are you making where you are? I'll give you 50% more, come and work here. And that's what's happening. So what you are seeing in there is artificially, I would say, creating a new civic society that is talented and well educated, in a sense, burning stages in the development of cities. Now, whether the rulers of these cities are going to be successful in developing civics at all level, that is in their native inhabitants and in the poor labor force that they are importing to build the cities, that's a different question. But at this point in time, these cities are becoming very attractive because of that class of expatriates that are creating new creative cultural spaces in these cities, that are empowering these spaces, that are populating these spaces. I mean, if you go to Dubai and you go to the Serkal region in Dubai where you have all these art galleries, you would realize that I would say 90% of these art galleries are owned and run by people who are not from Dubai. And therefore, you are bringing energy into your city by luring that energy to come into your city. Cairo no longer has the power to do that because of its poverty, because of its economic problems. The same applies to Baghdad and Damascus, and it's worse because they are ruined cities of ruined countries. So, in a sense, the Gulf cities are filling a void, but they also are using their enormous economic power to create occasions and opportunities for talent to come and help build them.
Nasser Rabbat, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
You're very welcome.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this one or previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.